Well, I come at this from a different angle, and that is having spent 20 years on the outer reaches of empire and watching what empire does. I began in Central America in the early 80s, and I watched every president do it. I was 5 years in Central America, 7 years in the Middle East, 3 years in the Balkans, and then I was based in Paris covering Al Qaeda. And the empire is the true face of white supremacy. The mask is off. It is brutal and violent. It is about the theft of the resources of others and the subjugation, almost always of poor people of color, with all of the accompanying lies that go about implanting democracy or liberty or fighting communism or whatever canard they throw out to justify their crimes. So that by the time I came back to the United States, and I went to El Salvador straight out of seminary, actually, I had a very clear understanding of the evil of empire, what corporate power was about, how it would stop at nothing to amass its profits, how brutal and violent and amoral it was, and how the ruling elites, Republican and Democrat, were completely in sync with this machine. And I think that very few Americans, with the exception of African Americans and Native Americans who have been internal victims of empire, have a really clear understanding of how truly evil empire is. So by the time I came back to the United States, and this was in the end after 9/11, I think I, because of my experience, grasped that the problem was the system, that I wasn't caught up in political personalities, and I was watching within the United States, and this is what happens in the twilight or the late stages of empire, because empires hollow themselves out from the insides. That's why our country's infrastructure is collapsing. That's why half the country lives in poverty or near poverty. But what they do is the harsher forms of control on the outer reaches of empire, as the homeland disintegrates, are migrate back to the homeland. Militarized drones, militarized police, wholesale surveillance, loss of civil liberties, including due process and habeas corpus, capturing systems of information. This is the fate of all empires in the terminal stage. Thucydides, when he writes about the decline of the Athenian Empire, he says the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. And I think because of that experience, I was able to see more clearly when I came back who we are truly and where we're going and how dangerous it is. And I will echo what Ray says. I mean, being a war correspondent is just one Pyrrhic victory after another. You walk into a village where the Serbs have massacred people, they cut the roads, and in Bosnia they would have snipers shooting at us. You file your story, you document the murders, the massacres that they carried out, so at least they couldn't kill anonymously. At least these people had a name. And but you knew you woke up the next morning and would do it again. And when I was in Sarajevo, we lost 45 foreign reporters who were killed. My photographer was shot 3 days after I got there. And in the end, I think that I don't share America's cultural mania for hope. What empowers me, what I think, again, let's go back to the long, 4 centuries long nightmare of white supremacy that African Americans have endured. It is that resistance is perhaps often the only freedom you have. And I use it in my talks and people have probably heard it, but in the end, I don't know if we will survive as a species. I don't even know if we'll win. But I know that these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. And in the end, I don't fight fascists because I'll win. I'll fight fascists because they are fascists. There's a moral imperative to this struggle. which I think Julian understands. And if we want to look ourselves, if we want to stand with any kind of autonomy or dignity or sense of moral autonomy, then we must resist, even if we don't succeed. And we can't get caught up in the tyranny of the practical, otherwise we never will succeed.
Well,
and on that, I'm going to check out because.
Well, Chris, I had one follow-up if I can.
Yeah.
There've been plenty of American and Western correspondents that have had the same amount of experience, particularly in the global South, covering these wars, and yet they usually hang out at the American embassy. They get briefed by the American officials there, and they never lose their cultural point of view, this Orientalist view towards others, and they come back to the U.S. and continue to support basically the agenda of the empire. What was different about you? Why are you special? Because you are. Why weren't you more like one of those other foreign correspondents? And how did you get along with them, by the way, while you were there?
Well, I hated them. I mean, in any war zone, only 10 or 15% go out. The rest of them are handout people. They eat out of the palms of the embassy officials. And we should be clear, it's very good for their careers. The New York Times loves it. I mean, they love that kind of access. I didn't look at them as journalists. I came out of, I don't think it's accidental that I came out of seminary, steeped in the social gospel, liberation theology. James Cone, the greatest contemporary theologian in America, who just died in April. I had a language. I mean, I understood that the moral life was about standing with and giving a voice to the extent that you can, or lifting up the voice of the oppressed. But I also understood the evil of institutions. Reinhold Niebuhr writes quite a bit about it, and how in the end they'll crush you. They always get you in the end. And so I think that was kind of, it made it easier because I never expected to be rewarded. I never thought that the New York Times was going to think that, and I finally, as you know, clashed with the New York Times quite publicly over the Iraq War. So I think that my academic or my theological background was helpful, and I think I just went with a different mission. I was freelancing in Salvador. The Washington Post offered me a job, but said you had to go back and cover like Montgomery County or something. I said, well, I came to cover the war. I didn't come to build a career at the Washington Post. How I ever ended up the New York Times, I'm sure the New York Times management is still scratching their head on that one, because I didn't come through the paper. I was hired from the outside, very rare. So I think that was it. I think that it was never about my career. It was about something else.
Terrific.
And I'm, I have a certain understanding for war reporters who will come into a war zone and don't want to put themselves at risk. I consider that actually a pretty sane and rational response, but they shouldn't be there. And because of that, a lot of it was driven by fear. They became tools of the empire. And, as you correctly point out, that was probably 85% of them.
Well, thank you, Chris, very much.
Chris, I'm so sorry. Before we let you go, I have to ask you one question too, because of your experience with the area, the region, and that's about Ecuador. We've been interviewing some Ecuadorian activists who have been outside the presidential palace in Quito, involved in some amazing demonstrations. They are hitting the chain fences with coins to show that Moreno has sold out the people of Ecuador. Is that another possibility, that there could be some type of overthrow of Moreno because he really has completely betrayed his base, and that could be a situation that could completely change where Julian is at present?
Well, he did. I mean, especially when you look at the campaign and how he presented himself, he was clearly selected by the imperial power, by the United States, and they knew in advance that he would do their bidding. You'd have to be in Ecuador to understand how fragile, and I'm not there, how fragile his situation is, so I can't answer that. However, that's very heartening because I hadn't heard that. It's very important that pressure be brought on Moreno, and it's very important that pressure be mounted in the streets of London. And I will tell you, I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, but if they bring Julian here, I'll be out on the streets here, because that's the only hope we have for him, and that's the only hope we have to hold back these rapidly closing walls that are cementing into place a very frightening corporate totalitarianism.
So the updates that we have from Ecuador, just for your benefit, are that the ex-Vice President George Glass has been imprisoned on false charges and is currently, I believe, on day 49 of a hunger strike. So
Wow.
There's a bunch of activism happening around that. And that Moreno had deposed or fired the entire Supreme Court, which was in itself a violation of the Ecuadorian constitution. So there's major issues around that. And then, of course, people are very upset that there's now a US military flyovers in Ecuador, and of course the reinstatement of the old base, which is also in violation of the constitution.
Right, and they didn't even give them a base in Miami. As Correa demanded.
British don't get a base, they just have to get a bunker at the drone air base.
Yeah, no, well, that's great. I lived in Latin America for 6 years, and I also lived in France, and I kind of wish, you know, we had a little more of that spirit in the United States. They're great. They're, you know, especially those leftists in Latin America, and the French leftists I admire them and feel completely at home with them, and we need more of them here. We need to follow their example.